Fort Bend Archeological Society, continuing our programs during the pandemic. Today, we are lucky to have Liz Horton from Arkansas. She's a survey archaeologist. Liz, what does that job entail?
So I work for the Arkansas Archeological Survey, and we're a research division of the University of Arkansas. We operate 10 research stations across the state, and we are fundamentally public archaeologists. So we do an enormous amount of public outreach, educational programs. I assist state parks in managing cultural resources. And then of course we do our own research as well.
Well, that's great. I've actually visited Toltec Mounds a few years ago. It's a beautiful site. And so I'm looking very forward. So let's get started.
Sure. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about Toltec Mounds as a site itself and just kind of give a basic overview of what it is. The site's located about dead center in the middle of the state. We're right at the edge of what we consider sort of the Ozark Escarpment in the Arkansas River Valley, really only about maybe 20 miles from Little Rock, Arkansas. It's a pretty easily accessible site. It's a great state park. And we're also kind of located sort of in an interesting place in terms of right at an intersection between upland environment and that delta lowland environment. The site is built at the edge of an oxbow lake, roughly about 600 or 700 AD, and then occupied up until about 1050 AD, although we have a little tiny bit of information indicates that people might have reused the site much later in the 1300s. And this is a basic aerial view of the site today from Google Earth. The site itself would have had about 18 mounds. There's one little mound off to the outside of what's a mile-long embankment that we've got some questions about. But we've got 18 mounds. Roughly 3 of them are still quite visible in the landscape. There are little bits and pieces of some of the other mounds that are still visible, but the big ones, mounds A, B, and C, are quite visible today. The rest of the site has mostly been either fully or partially leveled due to historic and modern agriculture. The embankment that goes around the site is a mile long, and at one time it would have stood about 10 feet tall. It's pretty impressive. So it's a late woodland site and what we consider to be a plum bayou culture site. And it's really interesting because we actually don't have a lot of evidence for village site at Toltec Mounds itself. It's mostly the mounds. And so we tend to think of this site as being not exactly an empty ceremonial site, but it has a very small caretaker population. And what it really is an absolutely critical sort of central community center for what would have been more dispersed farming villages and subsidiary mound sites across the landscape. People would have been coming here on an annual or biannual basis for big community activities. One of the things I want to stress right away, though, and we always do this in our public talks, park interpreters talk about this, and I do as well, because we get asked this question quite a bit. But Toltec Mounds, that name, is kind of an unfortunate thing. The site has absolutely no relationship whatsoever to Toltec culture in Mexico. The name is an unfortunate result of 19th century Euro-American sort of attitudes towards native peoples as being inferior and not sophisticated enough to have built these kind of big monumental mound sites. One of the other names for the site back in the 1800s was known as the Nat Mounds. Those were the 1800s landowners. Today, the people who built and lived the site we refer to as Plum Bayou people, so Plum Bayou culture. And we don't call them Toltecs because they're not. As I mentioned earlier, the site is a premier site. It's a center site. It is bigger than all of the other late woodland mound sites in Arkansas by a pretty good degree. The next biggest site is Baytown, located on the Mississippi River Valley, and it has 9 mounds. So Toltec is bigger by half. As I mentioned earlier, also, we're talking about an occupation landscape where we have multiple dispersed settlements all across the landscape. And this map gives you kind of a sense of where people are located in terms of these plum bayou sites. They tend to be concentrated in the central Arkansas River Valley, but we do see them spread both up in the lowlands and then also down into the Arkansas River Valley. We think of plum bayou peoples generally as being farming foragers. They're both hunters and gatherers, but they are also farmers. They're growing a whole series of domesticated crops, which I'll mention a little bit about later. 8600 is roughly our date for the adaptation of bow and arrow. So these folks are some of the earliest adapters of the use of the bow and arrow. And we have a lot of evidence for some local networks, but we have some interesting disparities in terms of evidence for long distance trade, which I'll show a couple pictures of why that's the case. How we know about the site, we have almost, so the first professional excavations were done in 1966. So we have many, many decades of research at Toltec Mounds. The bulk of the research was done by my predecessor, Dr. Martha Rawlinson, but others have worked at the site as well. And we've used an array of techniques to understand where the mounds are at and how they're being used. One of the interesting things we have is a whole series of 1930s up into 1960s aerial photographs of the site. And some of these earlier images, like this 1950s photograph here, the mounds, where the mounds were located at stand out really clearly in the aerial images. 2013. ER is electrical resistivity tomography. It's a way of doing sort of real deep profile views into the ground. So most sort of ground penetrating radar will only go about 1 meter deep. Well, the ERT can go much further than that. We put 69,000 data points into the surface of Mound P in 2012. And our big question there had to do with how the mound was built originally. One of the really interesting things about Toltec is that it's a late woodland site, but it has a kind of a Mississippian style mound plaza formation. And our question was whether or not Mound B was actually originally a more sort of rounded conical style woodland mound that by 8010-ish, 80,000 had been built into a platform style mound, which is what it is today. And when we did the ERT work, we could see quite clearly that it began life as a platform mound and it ended life as a platform mound. So it's an interesting phenomenon. So it's one of the earlier of the platform mounds. A little bit about Plum Bayou material culture. I tend to think of these folks as having some of the more simple but really elegant material I've ever seen. As a late woodland society, most of the ceramics that we get are basically Baytown plain. These are plain grog tempered ceramics, but we do see some really kind of exquisitely done materials. Platform style siltstone pipes are one of them. The use of hematite, magnetite, lamphorite for plummets. Then in 2010, the Arkansas Archeological Survey, along with the Arkansas Archeological Society, as a part of our annual training program, worked at Toltec at both Mound D and Mound P. And one of the artifacts they recovered from Mound P is one of only 3 examples from these Plum Bayou sites of these really elegant decorated bone pins. We also see, interestingly, one of the kind of diagnostics for these Plum Bayou sites in the central Arkansas River Valley is this incredible use of quartz crystal for making points and some other items as well. So we do see a lot of quartz crystal points at the site too. I mentioned earlier our ceramics tend to be pretty plain. That cooking and serving bowl is a good example of just sort of the very simple ceramics that we mostly see. But we do have a diagnostic decorative type known as French fork incised. And then we also see some examples of kind of simple ceramic styles, but they're these kind of elegant shapes. So in this case, there's an image of a fragment of what would have been a gourd effigy bowl. So it was in the shape of a gourd, sort of sliced in half and used as a bowl. The French fork incised is a little interesting. At Toltec itself, we have recovered a handful of French fork incised ceramics, and we know that it's a diagnostic for these Plum Bayou sites. But we also see it in some pretty far-flung places. So it's a little interesting. We don't have a lot of exotic long distance goods that show up at Toltec, like copper or marine shell, just little tiny bits. But we do see French fork and size ceramics all the way, if you go look at material culture from the earliest levels of occupation at Spiral Mounds in Oklahoma, there's French fork and size ceramics there. We also see it at places like Feltus Mound in Mississippi, and in some cases all the way into Florida. I should say, as an archaeologist, I'm also a paleobotanist, so the plants actually are the thing that are like, don't photograph the nicest, but are the most interest to me. So one of the things that I find really fascinating about Toltec and some of the research I've been doing is that we have, like I said, we have people farming, they're farmers. And they're using a whole suite of plants that we know were domesticated starting almost 5,000 years ago. So this is erect knotweed, sumpweed, maygrass, little barley, and at other plumb bayou sites, we see a unique domesticated plant that we don't see really at any other site, although we have some recent research indicating that it might be in some places that we hadn't thought of before. But we call it type X. It's a grass, it's a domesticated grass. And we have we know it's a grass, but we can't figure out quite which one it is. It has no living immediate relative. So we think of it as a lost crop. It's an extinct domesticated grain crop. Real recently also, we found one of the first examples of evidence for textile production at Toltec Mounds. And it's one little teeny tiny piece of pottery that has a textile impression on it of a very finely woven twined textile. I mentioned earlier that we don't see a whole lot of the exotic long distance materials. Here we have an image of a little tiny scrap of copper that was recovered from Mound S in the 1990s. We do see some galena at the site. The galena is probably coming from southern Missouri, we think. That's where there's a really big lead dome essentially under southern Missouri. We do have evidence for plumb bayou people either trading or going up into the Ouachita Mountains and getting things like hematite, magnetite, novaculite, quartz crystal, the lamphorite that they're using for some things like this really finely done owl effigy. And then the kind of interesting thing is that for the most part, these materials tend to be concentrated in the submound middens themselves. So we tend not to see these types of materials just sort of open on the site. They're normally only associated with the mound middens. I mentioned earlier this interesting issue with the French fork and size ceramics. This kind of gives you a look at what I was talking about. So we have French fork and size from Spiro. We also see it from an early Caddo site in southwestern Arkansas known as the Crenshaw site, which is a kind of a famous early Caddo site. And then we also have examples. The image here is from the Florida Museum of Natural History. So even though there's not a lot of exotic trade materials, there are clear indications that the plumb bayou people do have connections all across the Southeast. And there are some relationships that we probably really need to explore a little better. We don't totally understand what's going on. One of the kind of things I'll point out about Spiro is that not only do we have French fork and sized ceramics there at the roughly contemporaneous occupation to plumb bayou, so about 8 to 900 AD, but it's one of the few non-plumb bayou sites where we also see that unique domesticated type X grain being recovered from mound deposits. I sometimes have them almost like pilgrimages. We're coming from all over the landscape in the central Arkansas region, coming to Toltec, getting together to carry out a number of different activities. The mound building definitely be one of them, but probably also other kinds of both religious and just sort of social community building activities. Mound S is one of the mounds where we have a lot of this evidence from. Dr. Rawlinson did a series of excavations there in the 1990s, and there was just this enormous amount of faunal material that came from Mound S. Mound P also just absolutely filled with faunal material. It's, for every 10-centimeter layer of excavation, we'll have, 2 or 3 big liter to 2-liter bags of animal bone, some of which include things like bear teeth. So we have some kind of unusual animals showing up as well. So there are some kind of interesting things going on. One thing about Mound P is that even though we have this enormous amount of feasting debris showing up, we don't really have much in the way of indication of mound building for Mound P. Mound P in some ways might actually be just an enormous pile of feasting debris. It's sort of a working hypothesis that we're working with right now, but we're also still doing the analysis. We're not totally complete with that yet. Another aspect of the site, and this was work that Dr. Rawlinson did in the 1990s. She spent an enormous amount of time working on trying to understand how the site was laid out and potentially why it was laid out the way it was. Toltec has some kind of oddities in that it's a weird sort of transitional site between what are more typical late woodland mound sites like Marksville and Baytown, which it shares a lot of characteristics with, and then the later Mississippian period sites. So I mentioned earlier that we have this mound and plaza formation, which is a very Mississippian style layout, but we also have this enormous mile-long embankment, which is a very distinctive woodland aspect to these monumental earthwork sites. But one of the things that Dr. Rawlinson was really interested in is whether or not there were some sort of astronomical aspects to how the site was laid out. And she was able to determine that, in fact, 3 of the mounds in particular probably are related to this kind of critical way of tracking the movement of the heavenly bodies. And in particular, the mounds A and B, 2 of our biggest of the mounds, actually the 2 biggest mounds, and then Mound H, which today, if you're on the site, Mound H doesn't look like much. It's been mostly leveled, but it seems to be situated in a really critical spot for sort of observing, particularly solstice and equinox sunsets and sunrises. So this is one of the things that Martha had sort of tracked out, that you're able to kind of track solstices and equinoxes from these different mound locations. I mentioned earlier that we know that Plum Bayou people are farmers. We know that they're engaging in agricultural activities. And so in some ways, it would make sense for them to want to have a way to track and know that changing, shifting seasonal aspect of life, because that's absolutely fundamental for farmers. You need to know when to put in the crops, when to do the harvest, and knowing kind of time, how the seasons are going to change and when they're going to change. Solstices and equinoxes give us a pretty good indication for that. Mound H. Today, if you go to the site, well, when we get out dates and do group events again, the park actually offers a during the year where they'll take people out and you can go sit at Mound H, which normally we don't allow people to go to, and watch the setting sun. And it's a pretty phenomenal view to see the sun, especially during the equinox, set into the back of Mound A. The last little thing I'll talk about for Toltec is a project that I started back in 2014, 2015. That's a new aspect of the park itself, and kind of one of the first of its kind for a state park in the Southeast. 2014, I worked with the park interpreters to write a collaborative grant between the Arkansas Archeological Survey and Arkansas State Parks to build an interpretive garden. Now, interpretive gardens aren't a new thing, but this garden in many ways is, because it is focused strictly on what we know about plant use from the archaeological record. And in particular, it's focused on these series of what we refer to as the lost crops. And so we received the grant in 2015, got the garden built early in the spring of 2015. and you can go and walk it today and learn about both how we come to understand how plants are being used by people, but also what the plants are. And just to give folks a sense of what's there, kinds of plants that we're growing, and what are considered lost crop progenitors. So these aren't the plants. These are the plants would have been domesticated from. And they include maygrass, goosefoot, that's the plant I was figuring earlier, little barley, sumpweed, squash, sunflower, and erect knotweed. But then we're also growing a number of, ostensibly wild fruits, but probably these are plants that people are managing for the fruit production. And these include things like maypops, blueberries, plums, elderberry, all of which we find the seeds in the float samples that we take from the site itself. And then there's another kind of fairly unique set of plants, a unique aspect of this garden. And part of this comes out of the research that I've been doing in technological use of plants. We're also growing a whole series of fiber plants, plants that we know that people were using to produce textiles and basketry. And these include rattlesnake master, milkweeds, dogbane, as well as, of course, bottlegourd, which is another technical plant. And then we have some wild rye that are part of a living research experiment. One of the kind of interesting things for visitors when you come to Toltec is to keep in mind that this garden is actually a living research space, and there's current research going on in it. So not only is it a living interpretive landscape, but it's also an active research landscape. And there's our wonderful view of the equinox sunset behind Mound A, and it's the last image I'm going to leave you all with for Toltec Mounds. I sincerely hope that very soon people are going to be able to come back to the park and be able to go back into the museum. Right now you can come out to walk the park, but you can't go into the museum. But hopefully soon we'll be at a time when we'll be able to open things back up again. Of course, the Arkansas Archeological Survey, we work very closely with Arkansas Archeological Society. And so if you're interested in archaeology in Arkansas, I encourage people to reach out to the Arkansas Archeological Society. Thanks, Jay.
Liz, that was so awesome. So the type X grass is most closely associated with the modern ryegrasses?
Well, yes and no. We think type X might actually have been a hybrid grass. And one possibility is that it's a hybridization between wild rye and little barley.
Very
so
cool.
one of the things that we're doing, part of the problem is that so for a lot of the lost crops that we know about across the Southeast, an enormous amount of what we've been able to learn about them have come from plant materials recovered from dry contexts, caves and rock shelters, of which Arkansas has this incredible record. So we have all these caves and bluff shelters up in the northwest part of the state that are full of well-preserved plant materials. And so we've been able to do a huge amount of research on those dry plant materials, to include some of the work that we're doing currently, which is genetic studies. We're actually getting ancient DNA out of these. Unfortunately, with our Plum Bayou sites, we've only ever found type X carbonized. And that means that the plants are distorted, they're damaged, we can't do DNA studies, and we have to do a whole bunch of experimental morphological studies. So one of the reasons why I'm growing rye is because I've been doing a whole series of studies where I cook it and burn it to try to understand what's happening to the seed grains when it gets carbonized.
Very cool. And I've been there before, and what are the typical hours of operations during a normal period when it's not a pandemic?
Yeah, when we're not in the middle of a global pandemic. Normally the park is open Tuesdays through Sundays. And Tuesday through Saturday, it's like 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And on Sundays, it's like 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. Right now, Arkansas is going through a kind of a mitigated social distancing. So many of the state parks, the outdoor portions of the parks are still open. So you can go to Toltec right now and go to the outdoor part of the park.